talk about the evolution of gender equality, first we need to be sure we know what gender equality really means and its implications in our society. Gender equality is not only a fundamental right, but also a necessity. It's about half of the population's life, and sure, progress has been made in the past few years, but there's still a lot of work to do in order to achieve real equality everywhere. There are still discriminatory laws or social norms, women underrepresentation in leadership positions, and there's a huge percentage of women who have experienced physical, verbal, or sexual harassment by their partners, family, or by strangers on the street. There is still a lot of girls who experience genital mutilation, and I could go on. What this fifth goal wants is to finally get rid of gender inequality all over the world once and for all, and finally eliminating all forms of discrimination and violence towards women and giving them the same opportunities, access, and rights that men have. In Australia, the turning point of the start of the fight towards gender equality was 138 years ago, when Australia's first female trade union, Tailors Association of Melbourne, was established in December 1882, and later in 1884 when the first Victorian Women's Suffragist Society was formed. Since the turning point, progress has been made little by little, being the Working Women's Trade Union established in 1890, the age of consent risen from 13 to 16 in 1891, and women's right to vote in South Australia won in 1895. Several projects and associations happened in this decade, and also a lot of progress, being extremely important the one of non-Indigenous women's right to vote on the federal elections, the appearance of the first ever women to stand for the federal elections with a gold stain, and also the one of women to vote in the Victorian state elections. In 1919, Susan Grace Benney became the first female to be a member of a local governmental council in Australia, and in 1943, Dorothy Tanegi became the first woman to be senator in Australia. Both of them are examples of women empowerment and the few women who were able to achieve a political leadership charge in Australia in these decades. After many years fighting, finally in 1962, Indigenous women won the right to vote in the federal elections. In 1969, the first abortion rights were granted but with conditions. It was also in this decade where women were fighting for the right to be able to drink freely in bars, which is an example of women empowerment and the change of society towards gender equality. It was 1972 when the right to equal pay, which produced the rise of an almost 30% in women's salary, appeared, and it was 1974 when equal minimum wage was granted. In 1976, South Australia outlawed rape in marriage, which surprisingly hadn't been criminalized yet. Employment discrimination on the basis of gender and marital status were outlawed in 1977. The first female to have a political leadership position was Jane Haynes, leader of the Australian Democrats, and it was in 1983. And those are just some examples of how much women achieved and fought in the 19th and 20th centuries, where many associations and feminist groups were also founded. In the last 20 decades, a lot of progress has been made, starting from the abolishment of the law of provocation, which helped men reduce their sentence when they had harassed women in 2005, and the decriminalization of abortion in 2008. And these are just some examples of all of the groups and movements that were created in this decade. There are several important events that should be mentioned in this decade. In 2010, Julia Gillard became the first woman to be Prime Minister of Australia. She is also famous for her speech in 2012 when she stood against men lecturing women about sexism and misogyny. In 2011, after a Canadian officer told a rape survivor that she could have avoided it if she hadn't dressed like a slut, the association Slut Walk was formed with the purpose of ending rape culture and victim blaming. In 2015, laws made it illegal for anti-abortion protesters to harm or harass women who went in or out abortion clinics. In 2015, Victorian government also committed to having 50% of women in public board and in the bureaucracy. This same year, the Victorian Royal Commission admitted that Even though men and women can both be victims of domestic violence, the vast majority of perpetrators are men, while the victims are usually women and children. Linda Burney was the first indigenous woman to be elected into the House of Representatives in July 2016, which is a big step for intersectional feminism, since there is still racial and class discrimination amongst women. Several conferences have been held in Australia, such as the Breakthrough in 2016, attending all kinds of people and more than 100 speakers to talk about gender equality. There have also been social steps that, even though might seem insignificant, are necessary to achieve social equality, which has nothing to do with laws but with how we perceive women's place in society. An example of this is the launching of the Australian Female Football League in 2016, which generated a lot of controversy, as much as the first time a woman burst red while passing a motion in the Senate in 2017. It was also in this year when the taxes on tampons and sanitary products was removed after years of being considered as luxury products, when in reality they are just bare necessity products for mostly women. This, even though it might seem more related to economy, is very important and a huge step against inequality and the portrayal of women in society and our necessities. This and last year's event show that Australia is getting closer to real gender equality. In 2019, not only the Senate gave equal gender representation being constituted by 38 women and 38 men, but also abortion was finally decriminalized in New South Wales. The campaign Let Her Speak was able to achieve freedom for Tasmanian survivors of sexual assault to speak publicly, which has an important impact in society, and also the Australian first gender equality bill, which places gender equality in law for the first time in Australia, was introduced. This year, Samantha Randall, leader of Victorian Greens, made history becoming the first pregnant leader of an Australian political party. But as much as I've said in this timeline that Australia is almost there on reaching equality, there's still a lot of work to be done. The national gender pay gap is at 14%, and there's still a gap in workforce participation for people with young children, being only the 74% of women with children 5 years old or younger who participate, compared with the 95% of men. And even though women outnumber men in higher education completion rates, they don't get as much work as men do. And this is because of what I've said before. It doesn't matter that law portrays equality and tries to bring equality if society doesn't see it that way. If the women's place in society isn't still seen as equals, then there's nothing the law can do to change that. And that's what Australia should be focusing in changing the image of women in society. Because if the society doesn't accept that women are equal to men, as we may think it is accepted but it's not, then there's nothing law can do. So I believe that there should be more movements and more projects and more information brought to the Australians to see that women are in fact equal to men, and it doesn't matter what history says and history shows, but we are equals. So I think that this is what Australia should be focusing in social portrayal of women. What I mean by this is that yes, history shows that women are equals and that we have achieved a lot, but there's this reminiscence of what we were in the past, that we were less than men, and I believe that Australia, and as a matter every country in the world, should be focusing on changing this reminiscence image of women as something that is not equal to the men, but as a person, an independent person who deserves the same payment for the same work, who deserves opportunities to school, to work, and to live. And so even if there are several projects in Australia towards this, I believe that the focus should be on changing social image of women.